We often imagine history's refugee flows as a purely humanitarian story. People fleeing persecution, groups trying to survive, borders opening at the right time to release this valve of accumulated danger and potential loss of life. But what if I told you that in the case of Jewish immigration to Palestine in the 1930s and 40s, history teaches us something completely different? It's that rescue and survival are not always simply about humanitarian impulse. Sometimes strategy, ideology, and national ambition get in the way and shape who is saved and who is left behind. Today, we explore how the Zionist leadership recognized the danger facing European Jews, yet simultaneously chose which Jews would be brought to the land of Palestine, based on belief in Zionism, wealth, and usefulness. We look at the years 1933 to 1939, and then the war period, how British quotas reinforced this framework, and how the clandestine channel of Mossad Aliyah bypassed any restrictions. We examine how Ben-Gurion's own words and actions give weight to this selectivism, and we ask how echoes of that logic might still exist in Israeli Zionist politics today. When the Nazi regime rose to power in 1933, the Jewish world faced an escalating peril. Many Jews sought escape. Within the Zionist movement, the sense of urgency was present. Refugees, persecution, the shrinking of safe havens. But the Zionist leadership framed the situation primarily in terms of settlement and nation building. The one and only mission was the bringing of Jewish immigrants to Palestine to realize their promise of a homeland. Immigration numbers to Palestine increased early on. High thousands per annum during the 1920s, was followed by tens of thousands per year in the mid-1930s. But every refugee application did not simply translate to rescue. No, there was much more calculation involved. The Zionist-influenced system increasingly required certificates, sponsorship, occupational skills, capital, and readiness to settle. A Jewish migrant with few links, scant funds, or no commitment to Zionist settlement was less likely to gain attention, let alone entry. The Zionist leadership made strategic choices. They aimed to use this mass of migration not only as primarily rescue, but as foundational building blocks for a state. For example, the Havara Agreement between 1933 to 1939, signed by Nazi Germany and the Zionist Federation of Germany with the Anglo-Palestine Bank, enabled approximately 60,000 German Jews to immigrate to Palestine via asset transfers and export goods arrangements. But this arrangement disproportionately favored Jewish immigrants who had assets or could invest in the yeshuv's economy, not simply those most in need. Thus, while the danger to Europe's Jews was acknowledged, the response was filtered through the lens of who can build the national home rather than who could be saved. The institutional records of the Jewish Agency and related Zionist bodies show how settlement logic structured immigration. British governmental reports on Palestine noted that the Jewish Agency's budget spent more on colonization, immigration settlement, and industrial infrastructure than on rescue. For example, one British report shows the agency's allocations for agricultural colonization, urban colonization, investments, clearly ahead of direct refugee relief. Moreover, a 1938 Mandate-era Commission report recorded a core truth and this selectivism. It is the practice to have regard to the political creed of the several possible immigrants, rather than to their particular qualifications for admission to Palestine. The duty to select those best qualified to assist in the establishment of a Jewish national home in that country. That sentence speaks volumes. It shows how immigration policy was prejudiced, that politics was a main driver to select or ignore Jews immigrating to Palestine. The criteria applied, be it ideological, functional, or economic, were internal to the Zionist leadership's vision of a future state. One can almost hear, when European Jews were fleeing persecution, this leadership's thought process. Will this person settle? Will they contribute to the yeshuv? Do they align with our vision? Rescue them? Absolutely, but only the ones who fit the blueprint. There's no denying that British mandate policies introduced some level of constraint on Jewish immigration. Many who will oppose this video's perspective will resort to such policies as the hurdle to escape for many Jews from Europe. The White Paper of 1939 limited Jewish immigration to Palestine to 75,000 over 5 years and made future immigration subject to quote-unquote Arab consent. On paper, Britain held the gate, but digging deeper, we see that Zionist institutions wielded decisive control over the process. In other words, the Jewish agency and affiliated bodies allocated the blank certificates supplied by Britain, deciding who would use them. The British quota system might have limited numbers, but it did not determine which applicants got those places. Zionist leadership did. This meant that when immigration opportunities were scarce, the Zionist leadership's filters gained increased weight. The people who got in were those who met the settlement criteria. Those who did not were left outside. The control was internal, organizational, and structural. So when we talk about limited numbers and closed doors, it's only part of the truth. The other part concerns who was chosen to walk through that door and who was abandoned. Now, as another counter-argument, one could say that any people or organizations representing them who were looking at the project of building a new nation would of course prioritize the best qualified, best resourced, and most useful for the cause. But here's where the rhetoric and administrative choices of Zionist leadership fails them once again. Consider this quote attributed to David Ben-Gurion. "If I knew that it was possible to save all the children of Germany by transporting them to England and only half by transferring them to the land of Israel, I would choose the latter." Here is a moment of explicit prioritization. The safety of Jewish children was weighed against the creation of a Jewish state. It wasn't the British quota system as obstacle, no. The leadership themselves placed the national mission before universal rescue. Chaim Weizmann, for his part, declared, "From the depths of this tragedy, I want to save young people. The old ones will pass. They will bear their fate or they will not. They are dust, economic and moral dust in a cruel world. Only the branch of the youth shall survive." Further historical records show that Zionist leadership believed that the disaster facing European Jewry is not their direct responsibility or business. Zionist leaders believed the fight in Europe diverted them from their main task, building the Jewish state in Palestine. These statements underline a harsh reality. In wartime deliberations, the leadership chose to funnel resources, influence, and organizational energy into the Zionist settler project, rather than a broad rescue effort of all European Jews. As the journalist and activist Hades Thayer writes, "The leading Zionist organizations worked to undermine a worldwide anti-German boycott. Time and again, they chose to negotiate for the immigration of Jews to Palestine rather than saving Jews from the Holocaust. So the selectivity wasn't accidental. It was built in. It was organizational. It was ideological. The leadership defined the terms of rescue." As the war spread and the horror of the Holocaust unfolded, the stakes became existential. Yet the Zionist leadership's institutional priorities remained steadfast: immigration to Palestine and nation building. Rescue operations were limited, selective, and subordinate. One historian notes, "The rescue activities of the Zionist movement were concentrated on saving the elite of their own organizations in Europe. By selectivity is meant the choice of young men and women who are trained in Europe for productive purposes." Archival logs reveal that even when certificates were available, the Jewish agency issued a small number compared to the need. For example, in 1943, of thousands who applied, only 1,297 certificates were issued, and only 221 reached Palestine in 1944. So the idea wasn't only that the Jewish agency got to choose who would eventually emigrate to Palestine, but if that specific Jewish persona typology, that usefulness, wasn't available, no one would. A reality of quality over quantity, even in the saving of the Jewish people. Meanwhile, across the globe, The US-based Zionist lobby focused its major force on the drive for a Jewish state, rather than pressing for opening the gates in America or Britain for Jewish refugees. This lobby that eventually created the State of Israel out of nothing couldn't convince the powers that be to open these immigration doors. No, doors leading to the United States and Great Britain were closed to the Jews. One American author observes, during the Holocaust, the leadership of American Zionism concentrated its major force on the drive for a future Jewish state in Palestine. It consigned rescue to a distinctly secondary position. The result, many Jews in Europe, desperate, perishing, found no effective door of escape through Zionist organizational channels outside Palestine. The leadership's mission was state creation. The refugees were to fulfill that mission, or simply not to be saved at all. I really do appreciate you taking the time and watching the Kennedy Chronicles. Please do join our community by subscribing so that you don't miss out on any content regarding the Arab and Muslim history, identity, and modern condition. And if you really do enjoy the channel week in and week out and would like to support us even further, please do join us at our YouTube membership program as well as on Patreon. Thanks again. Now, imagine for a second that Zionist leaders had chosen differently, decided to prioritize the safe exodus of Jews from Europe on a much grander scale, concentrated their lobbying to enforce the opening of immigration gates in the West. With their zeal and clear intentions for rescue, how many more Jews could have been saved? 5%? 10%? Or even more of what eventually would be the final Holocaust Jewish body count? That's 300,000 to 600,000 people. Men, women, and children of all ages. Unfortunately, the Zionist leadership chose different, to spend their effort and funds on what was more critical, nation building. In internal correspondence and memoirs, Jewish relief workers noted frustration that funds were directed more into land purchase and settlement infrastructure than into mass relief of refugees. The priority was the Jewish national home rather than the Jewish diaspora saved. This is not a simple condemnation. It is an acknowledgement of a strategy, a choice. The leadership made calculations. Building a state required resources, settlement, immigrants who could integrate, who could pioneer. The rest of the European Jews didn't matter at all. And this is the point I want to get to. How this directly contradicts this facade that the Zionist state puts forth as a savior and refuge nation for the Jews of the world. This fake morality that speaks of caring for all people of the Jewish faith. How can any Israeli leader make such a claim? Even almost 80 years later since the establishment of Israel, we still see the application of that same ideology today. Consider military strategic decisions by the Israel Defense Forces. For example, those like the Hannibal Directive or other tactics prioritizing state goals in conflict zones. Look at how the deprioritization of hostage return lasts for years to then finally resurface onto the government's agenda and radar. Without diving into each case fully, the pattern today is that the national project takes precedence over individual or group humane rescue. The logic of the national Zionist mission persists. From 1933 onwards, the Zionist leadership confronted the existential plight of Europe's Jews. Yet their institutional decisions reveal a pattern. They selected, they filtered, they prioritized state building and settlement in Palestine above a maximal humanitarian rescue of their people. This is what the nation of Israel was based on. Not only the blood of Palestinians, but also on the blood of many Jews who were abandoned during the Second World War. The truth is uncomfortable. Rescue and settlement were entangled. Yet one mission was dominant over the other. And for many, the tragedy of Europe would become the building blocks of a new national home. The lives saved were real, yes, and the state created also real, of course. But the many lives that could not pass through the selective Zionist filters remind us that even in times of mass peril, choices remain. And those choices, especially when they're immoral, have dire consequences. The question remains, was it all worth the price?